Okay, so welcome everybody to another interview with an author from the forthcoming book, Deconstructing Whiteness, Empire and Mission. And today we're speaking to David Clough. So could you introduce yourself, please, David?
Yes, hi. My name's David Clough. I'm Chair in Theology and Applied Sciences at the University of Aberdeen. I'm also currently serving as President of the Society for the Study of Theology, and I'm a past President of the Society for the Study of Christian Ethics.
Okay, thank you. Could you briefly describe what your chapter's about?
Yeah, so my chapter is focusing on how whiteness functions in the Christian Theological Academy in the UK. And so I'm interested in assessing what the problems are in relation to disadvantaging Black minority ethnic, global majority heritage people as students and staff in Christian academic theology in the UK, and then assessing what might be the priority actions to do in response. So I'm presenting data that whiteness functions to have negative impacts on minority ethnic people in relation to recruiting students, in relation to the attainment of students, in relation to their progression to higher degrees, their employment in academic posts, and being promoted in those academic posts. So right through the academic system, whiteness is really clearly functioning in problematic ways. And while there hasn't been enough research done to document exactly how that works in theology and religious studies in general, or in Christian theology in particular, and I argue that we need to do more research, it's obvious that there are problems here, and as well as the kinds of problems that exist in similar disciplines like history, I think Christian theologians need particularly to be paying attention to how the disadvantage that's functioning today echoes the way in which Christian theology has been in part responsible for constructing whiteness and constructing structures of racism in the past. And so that's an argument, I think, for Christian theologians in particular to be attentive to this issue. And so towards the end of the chapter, I argue that there are 4 key things we ought to be paying attention to, or fellow academics ought to be paying attention to in addressing the problem. We ought to be engaging in much more wide-ranging discussion of racism and whiteness in academic contexts and Christian theological contexts. We ought to be doing more research to understand the problem better. We ought to be paying attention, especially in relation to staff recruitment, because that has so many multiple impacts as to how the discipline functions and is seen. And finally, we ought to be reviewing the content both of research and teaching to make sure that it's alert to the issues of how whiteness functions and that we do better in relation to peer review of academic research and are thinking about what goes into the curriculum and how it's taught.
Thank you. I think you've partly answered the question already, but I would say, what made you take this particular approach to your chapter?
Thanks. Yeah, I'm convinced it's a really big problem, and one that not enough academics in theology have been paying attention to, and especially not enough white academics in theology. So I feel a particular responsibility to be making the best case I can to be analysing the problem and proposing responses to peers who are academics in Christian theology in the UK. And so the approach I took in my chapter is just to try and, as clearly as possible, say, okay, what's the problem here? And what can those in the Christian Theological Academy in the UK do about it? And so I'm trying to, as crisply and clearly as possible, lay out those 2 parts in order to motivate people to be taking notice and taking action.
Thank you. So moving away from the chapter more to yourself, what would you say has shaped your social conscience, especially in terms of race and diversity?
Yeah, so I've been working in Christian theological ethics for a long time, but what I've only realized over the last decade or so is that for a long time I saw the discipline as sort of me having particular research interests. Like I've been interested in the ethics of Karl Barth. I've been interested in issues in relation to war and peace. I've been interested in relation to Christian theology and ethics in relation to animals. And for a long time, I had a sense of, okay, so race is another specialist interest that some academics in Christian ethics and Christian theology are interested in, but I do this other stuff. And it took a very long time, and an embarrassingly long time, for me to recognize that's a really poor analysis of the situation. And so there was a sort of growing awareness over just the last 10 years. And it feels like I had to take quite a lot of time to sort of unlearn quite a lot of what had been passed on to me in terms of what it meant to be doing Christian theology and Christian ethics well, where, issues of race had not ever been part of my theological education, at any point. And what really crystallized things for me was when I was invited to speak at a conference on Karl Barth at the Karl Barth Center in Princeton in 2018. And just a couple of months before the conference was the time when James Cone died. And when I saw that, I knew that James Cone had studied Karl Barth. And when I saw news of his death, I thought, well, I ought to ditch what I'd been planning to say, and I ought to give some attention to how scholars of Barth have responded to Cone's engagement with Barth. And what I was really shocked to discover is that in all of my literature search, I found only 2 paragraphs from white scholars of Barth responding to James Cone, this pioneering huge figure of 20th century theology, his critiques of Karl Barth and the way Karl Barth had been received. And I thought that was utterly shocking. And I suddenly felt that the discipline that I'd been part of just had this, major systemic sort of absence, a real failure to engage with a really important theological challenge. And that challenge, it felt like it was directed to me as well as everyone else in being inattentive to this issue. And so that was the first time, that 2018 conference in Princeton was the first time I talked publicly about theology and race, which, as I say, feels embarrassingly late in my academic career to come and say something. And since then, I've been continuing to look at ways to name that issue in my own research, and be much more proactive where I've got opportunities in relation to leadership roles within the discipline to encourage wider attention to this issue.
Thank you. So building on that, what do you think are the biggest challenges that face the church and or the wider society in terms of creating frameworks for social justice?
What came to me as I was writing this chapter was just this really clear sense that the problem is that the people best placed to take action to address the way that whiteness functions are those who are least well placed to either recognize the problem and to be motivated to respond. So they're likely to be predominant, people in positions of power in relation to church and academy, in academic theology, are disproportionately white, they're disproportionately male, they're disproportionately people who look like me. And that means that they've been advantaged in relation to people who are racialized in other ways through their academic career, very probably. And so that means they've got least motivation for wanting to sort of examine that and be critically aware of that and address it. But it also means they're least well equipped to recognize the magnitude of the problems that whiteness and institutional racism causes within their disciplines, because they're not going to see things as well as those who've been racialized in other ways. And so therefore, it's a real structural challenge to get a sense of how things will change when the people in a position who are the best placed to change things are those least qualified to do so. And so for me, that means people who do begin to see what is required, there's all the more reason for them to be sort of active in trying to speak to peers about the importance of this issue. And it also means that, there's this basic principle of activism that nobody ever gives up power willingly. And so alongside a sort of attempts to reach out to those in power, I would be, very supportive of those mobilizing to make clear the sort of unacceptability of the status quo, and a sort of protest against the people continuing to sort of perpetuate the disciplines in their current form without critical attention. So there's inevitably going to be a need for power from below, as well as conscientious action by those already in positions of power, I think.
Yes, thank you. So what do you hope people will take from your chapter?
I'm an academic, but I'm also I would see myself as something of an activist, and I really hope that people with interests in British Christian theology at all levels, in it, whether as students or staff members or kind of interested parties beyond academia, will recognize the importance of the issues that I'm describing in the chapter, and will feel motivated to act in response. So it's action that I'm most interested in, and action in relation to a greater prominence of this issue in Christian academic theological discussions, more research, more attention in recruitment processes, and more attention to this issue about what research we're publishing, and the teaching that we're doing. One thing I'm really struck by is the power of the discipline to replicate itself. People tend to teach what they were taught, and to write out of their academic formation. And so, change is a real job of work. And if we tolerate kind of status quo in this area of, for any longer, it's likely to be decades before we see significant action in response to the problems I'm discussing. So that's another reason to be highly motivated to be looking for change now. I do see signs of hope. So I'm just back from the annual conference of the Society for the Study of Theology. And in the last 10 years, that society has transformed from being almost exclusively white to being a place where Black and brown people come and say they feel welcome, and they can network, and they can find the conference to be a resource for their professional development. So I'm really glad for that. But there's much, much more work to do of that kind in other academic societies and in the academy as a whole.
Okay, thanks. That's great to hear. That sounds very encouraging. So thank you, David, for sharing your thoughts with us today. Thank you.
It's a pleasure, Carol. Thank you.